The glass shattered against the wall before Elena Whitmore even stepped through the front door of the mansion. She froze on the threshold, her hand still on the cold brass handle, listening to the shouting echo down the marble hallway. A man's voice, low and sharp, cut through the air like a blade. Somewhere inside, a woman was crying, and heavy footsteps stormed away toward the east wing. Elena had been warned. The housekeeping agency told her plainly that this was not an ordinary job. The man who lived in this house had already sent away 3 housekeepers in 2 months. One had quit after only 3 days. Another had left in tears without even collecting her final pay. But Elena needed the money more than she needed her pride, and so she stepped inside anyway, her small suitcase bumping against her leg. The entrance hall alone was larger than the entire apartment she shared with her mother. Tall marble columns rose toward a painted ceiling. A wide staircase curved upward like something from a film. Elena had never seen a house like this, not once in her 26 years, and for a moment, she almost forgot why she was afraid. Then the voice returned, closer now, and she remembered exactly why. "I do not care what excuse he gives me," the man said, his tone flat and dangerous. "Tell him I want an answer by morning, or he will not enjoy the conversation we have instead." A tall man rounded the corner, dressed in a dark tailored suit, his sleeves rolled to the forearm as though he had just finished dealing with something unpleasant. His jaw was tense, his dark eyes sharp enough to cut glass. He stopped when he saw her standing there, suitcase in hand, out of place among the marble and gold. "Who let you in?" he said. It was not really a question. "I was told to report today, sir," Elena answered, keeping her voice steady, even though her heart hammered against her ribs. "My name is Elena Whitmore. I am the new housekeeper." The man studied her for a long moment, the way someone studies a problem they have not yet decided how to solve. His eyes moved over her plain gray coat, her tired face, the dark circles beneath her eyes that no amount of sleep ever seemed to fix anymore. Whatever he saw did not seem to impress him. "Another one," he muttered, almost to himself. "How much did my aunt pay you to take this job?" "I was not paid in advance, sir. I was told the position pays well, and that the household needs help." "The household needs a great many things," he said coldly. "A housekeeper who does not run away crying by the end of the week is only one of them." Elena said nothing. She had learned long ago that silence was often the safest answer. He turned and walked away without another word, leaving her standing alone in the enormous hall, her suitcase still gripped tightly in her hand. A moment later, an older woman appeared from a side door, her expression a mixture of sympathy and warning. "Do not mind him," the woman said quietly. "My nephew has not been the same since his father passed. I am Margaret. I run the household staff, what is left of it. You must be Elena." "Yes, ma'am. Come, let me show you your room before he decides to send you away, before you even unpack." Margaret led her up a smaller staircase near the back of the house, explaining the rules of the household in a low, careful voice, as though the walls themselves might report her words back to the man downstairs. His name, Elena learned, was Vincent Marchetti. His family controlled a large portion of the city's shipping business, though everyone in the house spoke of it the way people speak of things they are afraid to fully explain. There were men stationed at every entrance, quiet and watchful, dressed like ordinary staff but carrying themselves like something else entirely. There were rooms Elena was told never to enter. There were questions she was told never to ask. "Keep your head down, do your work well, and do not speak unless he speaks to you first," Margaret said, stopping outside a small but comfortable room near the end of the hall. "That is how you survive here." Elena nodded, though her mind was already elsewhere, calculating the hours until her next shift at the diner across town, the medicine her mother needed by the end of the week, the rent that was already 2 weeks late. She had taken this job because it paid more in 1 month than her old job paid in 3, and because her mother's illness did not care whether Elena was frightened of the man who signed her paycheck. That night, Elena barely slept. She worked in the mansion from early morning until the afternoon, then rushed across the city on a crowded bus to her second job at a small diner, where she served coffee and sandwiches to tired truck drivers, until well past midnight. By the time she returned to the mansion and collapsed into her narrow bed, she had perhaps 4 hours before the household staff would wake again to begin the next day. She did not see Vincent again for 2 full days. He kept to his study and the east wing, moving through the house like a storm that had temporarily passed. The other staff members spoke of him in careful whispers. He had inherited the family business far younger than expected, they said, after his father died suddenly under circumstances no one discussed openly. Since then, he trusted almost no one, and his temper had grown sharper with every year that passed. On the 3rd day, Elena was assigned to clean his study while he was away at a meeting. The room was dark and orderly, heavy wooden shelves lined with books that looked as though they had never been opened, a large desk covered in papers she was careful not to touch. A single photograph sat in a silver frame on the corner of the desk, a much younger Vincent standing beside an older man who shared his sharp jaw and serious eyes. Elena wondered, briefly, what kind of boy he had been before he became the man who shattered glass against walls. She was still dusting the bookshelves when the study door opened without warning, and Vincent walked in far earlier than expected. Elena straightened immediately, her cloth still in hand, bracing herself for the anger she had already heard echo through this house. Instead, he simply stopped in the doorway and looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You are still here," he said. "Yes, sir. I was told to clean this room today. That is not what I meant." His eyes narrowed slightly, studying her the way he had on the first day, as though trying to solve something that refused to make sense. "Most people who work in this house avoid this room entirely when I am not in it. They fear I will notice something out of place and blame them for it." "I have not touched your desk, sir. Only the shelves." Something flickered across his face, not quite a smile, but close enough to soften the hard line of his mouth for a brief moment. "Good instinct," he said. "Keep it that way." He crossed the room and sat behind his desk, pulling papers toward him, as though she were no longer there. Elena finished her work quickly and quietly, careful not to make a sound, and slipped out of the room without another word passing between them. She told herself it meant nothing, that he was simply too tired or too distracted to shout at her that day. She did not yet understand that Vincent Marchetti rarely wasted his anger on people who did not deserve it, and that something about her quiet steadiness had already caught his attention in a way he could not quite explain to himself. Over the following days, Elena settled into an exhausting rhythm. Mornings at the mansion, dusting rooms she was barely allowed to enter, learning the strange rules of a household built on secrets. Afternoons, rushing across the city to the diner, where her feet ached and her eyes burned from lack of sleep. Nights collapsing into bed far too briefly before the cycle began again. She rarely saw her mother anymore, though she called her every evening from the small bus stop outside the diner, promising that everything was fine, that the new job paid well, that she would visit soon. She did not tell her mother about the shouting in the mansion, or the guards at the gates, or the way the entire household seemed to hold its breath whenever Vincent Marchetti walked through a room. Some things, she decided, were easier carried alone. By the end of her first week, exhaustion had settled so deeply into her bones that even small tasks felt heavy. She moved through the mansion like a ghost, quiet and efficient, careful never to draw attention to herself. The other staff noticed her endurance and began to whisper that perhaps this one would last longer than the others. Margaret watched her with a mixture of concern and quiet approval, though she said little, aware that Elena's silence was not weakness but survival. Vincent, for his part, noticed her more than he intended to. He noticed the way she never flinched when his voice rose, the way she kept working steadily even when the rest of the house seemed to hold its breath around him. He noticed the dark circles beneath her eyes that deepened with each passing day, though she never once complained. He told himself it did not matter, that staff came and went in this house, that he could not afford to notice anyone too closely in a life built on danger and mistrust. But late one evening, as he walked past the small sitting room near his study, he saw her through the half-open door, seated on the edge of a chair with a stack of papers she was meant to organize, her eyes fluttering closed for just a moment before she caught herself and forced them open again. She looked, he thought, like someone carrying a weight far too heavy for one person to bear alone. He did not say anything. He simply stood there for a moment longer than he meant to, watching the quiet, exhausted woman his aunt had hired without his approval, and felt something shift uncomfortably in his chest, something he could not yet name, and was not at all sure he wanted to. Then he turned and walked away, telling himself it meant nothing at all. But it was the first time in a very long while that Vincent Marchetti had noticed anyone at all. The following morning brought a different kind of tension to the mansion. Elena woke before dawn, her body aching from the day before, and made her way down to the kitchen, where Margaret was already preparing breakfast trays. The older woman's face looked tighter than usual, her movements quicker, less steady. "Is something wrong?" Elena asked, keeping her voice low. Margaret glanced toward the hallway before answering. "There was trouble last night. One of the men who works for Mr. Marchetti did not report in when he was expected to. It has put the whole house on edge. When things like this happen, it is best to stay out of sight and out of mind." Elena nodded, though a small knot of fear formed in her stomach. She had tried, since her first day, not to think too deeply about what kind of business truly kept this house running, about the guards at the gates, or the black cars that came and went at strange hours. She simply worked, kept her eyes down, and counted the days until her next payment arrived. By mid-morning, the tension in the house had grown thick enough to feel in the air itself. Men she did not recognize moved through the halls in low, urgent conversation. Vincent's study door remained shut for hours, though she could hear voices rising and falling behind it, none of them calm. Elena kept to the far side of the house, dusting rooms that did not need dusting, folding linens that were already folded, anything to stay busy and unseen. It was well past noon when Margaret found her in the linen closet and told her, in a rushed whisper, that she was needed to bring a tray of coffee to the study. The usual staff member assigned to such tasks had been sent on an errand, and there was no one else available. "Just set it down and leave," Margaret instructed. "Do not linger. Do not ask questions." Elena's hands trembled slightly as she carried the tray down the long hallway, though she told herself it was only exhaustion. She knocked once, and a sharp voice told her to enter. Inside, the study looked different than it had before. Two men she did not recognize stood near the window, their expressions grim. Vincent sat behind his desk, his sleeves rolled up, a phone pressed to his ear, his voice low and controlled in a way that somehow felt more frightening than shouting. He glanced up as she entered, his eyes flicking briefly toward her, before returning to whatever conversation held his attention. Elena set the tray down as quietly as she could, and turned to leave, careful not to make eye contact with anyone in the room. She had almost reached the door when Vincent's voice cut through the tense silence. "Wait." She stopped, her heart pounding, unsure whether she had done something wrong. He finished his call, set the phone down with more force than necessary, and looked at her for a long moment before speaking again. "You are not afraid," he said, though it sounded more like an observation than a question. "I am afraid, sir," Elena answered honestly, surprising herself with her own boldness. "I am simply trying not to show it, because I need this job." Something in his expression shifted again, that same unreadable flicker she had seen once before. The two men near the window exchanged a glance, clearly unused to seeing anyone speak so plainly to their employer. "You may go," Vincent said finally, his voice quieter than before. Elena did not wait to be told twice. She left the study as quickly as she could without running, her hands still shaking slightly as she closed the door behind her. She did not know what had just happened, only that something about the exchange had left her feeling strangely exposed, as though he had seen something in her she had not meant to reveal. She did not have time to think about it further. Her shift at the diner began in less than 2 hours, and she still had work to finish before she could leave the mansion. She pushed the strange encounter from her mind and returned to her duties, telling herself, as she always did, that she simply needed to survive one day at a time. But as she hurried down the hallway, she did not see Vincent step to his study window and watch her small figure cross the courtyard below, her shoulders squared, despite the exhaustion that clearly weighed on her. He did not understand why he had told her to wait. He did not understand why her honest answer had settled something restless in his chest, that violence and threats never could. He only knew that for the first time since his father's death, someone in this house had looked him in the eye, without either fear turning to flattery or flattery turning to lies, and he found that he wanted to see it again. The knock on the study door came just after 9 at night, and Elena almost dropped the stack of folders in her arms when Vincent's voice answered, before she could even announce herself. He had begun asking for her by name over the past week, a small change that had not gone unnoticed by the rest of the household staff, though no one dared say anything about it directly. "Enter," he said. Elena pushed the door open with her shoulder, balancing the folders Margaret had asked her to deliver. The study was dim, lit only by a single desk lamp, and Vincent sat with his head bowed over a pile of documents, his tie loosened, his usual sharp composure worn thin by whatever had kept him working long past midnight for the past several nights. "Set them there," he said, gesturing toward the edge of the desk without looking up. She did as he asked, then hesitated for a moment longer than necessary, studying the deep lines of exhaustion carved into his face. He looked, she thought, the way she often felt, though she would never have dared say so aloud. "Is there something else?" he asked, finally glancing up. "No, sir. I only wondered if you needed anything before I finish for the night." He studied her for a long moment, the way he often did now, as though trying to decide something he had not yet fully admitted to himself. "You look tired," he said finally. Elena almost laughed at the observation, though she caught herself in time. "I am always tired, sir. I have grown used to it." That is not something a person should grow used to. Perhaps not. But it is what it is. He did not respond immediately, and for a moment, the silence between them felt strangely comfortable, a rare pause in a house that usually hummed with tension. Then, he gestured toward the small couch near the window. "Sit for a moment." "You have been standing since dawn, I imagine." Elena blinked, unsure whether she had heard him correctly. "Sir, I do not think that would be appropriate." "I am not asking your opinion on appropriateness. I am telling you to sit down before you fall down." There was no cruelty in his voice, only a strange, quiet insistence that left her unsure how to refuse. She lowered herself onto the edge of the couch, her back straight, her hands folded carefully in her lap, as though sitting incorrectly might somehow undo whatever fragile truce had formed between them over the past week. Vincent returned to his papers, and for a while neither of them spoke. Elena watched the lamplight flicker faintly against the dark wood of the shelves, her eyelids growing heavier with each passing minute, despite her best efforts to stay alert. She had worked 17 hours that day, moving between the mansion and the diner without rest, and her body had reached a point of exhaustion that no amount of willpower could overcome. She told herself she would just close her eyes for a moment, only a moment, enough to steady herself before standing to leave. She did not remember falling asleep. When Vincent looked up nearly 20 minutes later, expecting to ask her a question about the schedule for the following week, he found her slumped sideways on the couch, her head resting against the cushion, her breathing slow and even. For a moment he simply stared, unsure what to do with the sight in front of him. He had not seen genuine, unguarded rest in this house in longer than he could remember, not from his staff, not from his guards, not even from himself. He should have woken her. He should have called for Margaret to help her back to her room, or simply told her sharply to return to her duties, the way he would have done with anyone else who dared fall asleep in his study uninvited. Instead, he found himself standing quietly, watching the gentle rise and fall of her shoulders, the way the tension that always lived in her face had finally, briefly, disappeared. He moved closer, intending only to wake her gently, but as he leaned down, she shifted in her sleep, and her head came to rest against his shoulder, her exhaustion too deep to notice the change. Vincent went very still, his breath catching in his throat, uncertain whether to pull away or remain exactly where he was. He remained. For the first time in years, Vincent Marchetti sat motionless, allowing another person's weight to rest against him, and felt something inside his chest loosen that he had not even realized was clenched so tightly. The silence of the room, usually heavy with the weight of decisions and threats and danger, felt different now, softer somehow, as though her quiet presence had pushed all of it gently to the side. He did not know how long he sat like that, minutes, perhaps longer. He only knew that when the study door opened without warning, and one of his most trusted men, Dominic, stepped inside to deliver an urgent message, he froze in the doorway at the sight before him, his expression caught somewhere between disbelief and confusion. "Sir," Dominic said carefully, clearly unsure whether to continue or retreat. Vincent's eyes flicked toward him, sharp and immediate, though he did not move, careful not to disturb the sleeping woman against his shoulder. "This had better be important," he said, his voice low. "It can wait," Dominic said quickly, already stepping back through the door. "It can wait until morning." The door closed softly, and Vincent was left alone again, with the quiet weight of Elena's trust resting against him, unaware of the small, unprecedented moment she had just created, without ever opening her eyes. It was nearly an hour before she stirred, her body slowly waking as though pulled reluctantly back from some deep, necessary rest. She blinked, disoriented, and it took several long seconds for her to realize where she was, and against whom she had fallen asleep. Horror flooded her face as she jerked upright, nearly falling off the edge of the couch in her haste to put distance between them. "I am so sorry, sir," she said, her voice rushed and mortified, color rising in her cheeks. "I did not mean to. I do not know how that happened. I will not let it happen again. Please do not." "Elena." She stopped abruptly at the sound of her own name, spoken so rarely by him that it startled her into silence. "You did nothing wrong," Vincent said quietly. His voice carried none of the sharpness she had braced herself for. "You were exhausted. It happens. It should not happen with you, sir. It was disrespectful. Elena," he said again, more firmly this time, though still without anger. "Stop apologizing." She fell silent, watching him with wide, uncertain eyes, unable to make sense of the strange gentleness in a man the entire household feared. He studied her for a long moment, as though weighing something carefully in his mind before he spoke again. "How many hours did you work today?" The question caught her off guard. "I do not see how that is relevant, sir." "It is relevant because I am asking." She hesitated, then answered honestly, too tired to construct a careful lie. 17 hours. I work here in the mornings and afternoons, and at a diner across the city most evenings." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Why?" "Because I need the money, sir. My mother is ill, and the medicine she requires is expensive. This position pays well, but not well enough on its own to cover everything, not yet." Vincent said nothing for a long moment, his expression unreadable, though something behind his eyes had clearly shifted. Elena, suddenly aware of how much she had revealed, straightened her shoulders and moved to stand. "I should return to my room, sir. I apologize again for earlier." "Elena." She paused at the door, glancing back at him. "You will not work at that diner tomorrow evening," he said. It was not quite a question, but it was not entirely a command either, spoken instead in a tone she could not quite place. "You will rest instead." "Sir, I cannot afford to miss a shift. I am not asking you to explain your finances to me. I am telling you to rest." His voice softened slightly, an unfamiliar gentleness creeping into words that usually carried only authority. "Consider it an order, if that makes it easier to accept." Elena stared at him, unsure how to respond to an order that felt, somehow, like the first act of genuine kindness anyone in this house had shown her since she arrived. "Yes, sir," she said finally, quietly. She left the study with her heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with fear, though she could not have explained, even to herself, exactly what had replaced it. Behind her, Vincent remained seated at his desk, long after the door closed, staring at the space on the couch where she had slept, turning over in his mind a realization he was not yet ready to accept. For years, he had surrounded himself with people who feared him, respected him, or wanted something from him. He had never once, in all that time, allowed himself to imagine that a quiet, exhausted young woman, with nothing to offer him but honesty, could unsettle him more deeply than any rival family ever had. The following days brought small, quiet changes to the mansion that only the most observant members of the household noticed. Vincent began requesting that Elena personally deliver his meals, though he rarely spoke more than a few words to her when she did. He asked Margaret, without explanation, to adjust the household schedule so that Elena's mornings began later, allowing her more rest before her shift began. He said nothing about the diner, though when Elena mentioned, almost shyly, that she had reduced her hours there, he only nodded once and said nothing further. Margaret watched these changes with growing curiosity, though she was wise enough not to comment on them directly, at least not yet. She had worked for the Marchetti family long enough to recognize when something significant was shifting beneath the surface of a household built on careful control, and she suspected that this particular shift had everything to do with the quiet young woman who had fallen asleep, uninvited, on Vincent Marchetti's shoulder. Elena, for her part, tried not to read too much into any of it. She told herself that powerful men were simply unpredictable, that his sudden attentiveness meant nothing beyond ordinary consideration for an employee who had proven herself reliable. She focused instead on her mother, on the medicine bills that had begun, mysteriously, to arrive already paid in part, though she could not imagine how or why. She did not yet know that the answer to that mystery slept only a few rooms away from her own, carrying secrets far heavier than she could have guessed, and a growing, unfamiliar tenderness he did not yet know how to name. 3 days after the night in the study, Elena found herself summoned to the East Wing for the first time since her arrival, a part of the mansion Margaret had warned her never to enter without direct permission. A guard she did not recognize led her down a long corridor lined with closed doors, stopping finally at one near the end of the hall. "Mr. Marchetti asked for you," the guard said simply, before knocking twice and stepping aside. Elena entered cautiously, unsure what to expect. The room was smaller than the study, arranged more like a private sitting area than an office, with a fireplace burning low against the evening chill, and 2 chairs positioned near a window overlooking the gardens. Vincent stood near the fireplace, his jacket removed, looking, for the first time since she had known him, almost relaxed. "You wanted to see me, sir," Elena said, keeping her voice steady despite the unfamiliar setting. "Sit," he said, gesturing toward one of the chairs. "I have questions, and I would prefer you answer them honestly." Elena lowered herself into the chair, her hands folded in her lap out of habit, bracing herself for whatever interrogation might follow. Instead, Vincent asked about her mother's illness, listening carefully as she explained the diagnosis, the treatments, the slow decline that had begun nearly 2 years earlier. He asked about her father, and she told him, simply, that he had left when she was young, leaving her mother to raise her alone in a small apartment on the edge of the city. "You have no other family," he said. It was not quite a question. "No, sir. It has always been just the 2 of us." He nodded slowly, his gaze drifting toward the fire, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. "I understand what it is to lose family," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. "My father died 3 years ago. Since then, I have learned that trust is the most dangerous thing a person in my position can afford to give." Elena said nothing, sensing that he was not asking for a response, only allowing himself, perhaps for the first time in a long while, to speak the thought aloud to someone who was not a rival or a subordinate. "Why are you telling me this, sir?" she asked finally, unable to stop herself. He turned to look at her then, his expression more open than she had ever seen it. "I am not entirely certain," he admitted. "I have not spoken so freely with anyone, in a very long time." The admission hung in the air between them, fragile and unfamiliar, and for a moment, neither of them seemed to know what to do with it. Elena, unused to such honesty from a man who held so much power over her employment, and, in many ways, her survival, found herself unsure whether to feel comforted or afraid. "I should return to my duties, sir," she said eventually, rising from the chair. Vincent nodded, though something in his expression suggested he had hoped she might stay longer. "Elena." She paused at the door, glancing back. "Thank you," he said simply, "for listening." She left the room with her heart racing, uncertain what exactly had just happened, only that something between them had shifted, in a way that could not easily be undone. Over the following week, small moments like this became more frequent, though never obvious enough to draw attention from the rest of the household. Vincent found reasons to linger near the rooms Elena cleaned, asking questions about her day that had nothing to do with household duties. Elena, despite her best efforts to remain professionally distant, found herself looking forward to these brief exchanges more than she cared to admit, even to herself. Margaret noticed, of course, as she noticed most things within the walls of the mansion. She said nothing directly to Elena, though one evening, while the 2 of them folded linens together in the laundry room, she offered a quiet warning that Elena would not fully understand until much later. Be careful, Margaret said, not unkindly. Men like Vincent do not know how to want something gently. When they want something, they want it entirely, and the world around them often suffers for it. I do not know what you mean, Elena said, though her cheeks warmed slightly at the implication. You will, Margaret said simply, returning to her work. Elena tried to push the conversation from her mind, focusing instead on her mother's improving health, on the medical bills that continued, mysteriously, to shrink each week despite her own inability to pay them fully. She had asked Margaret about it once, only to be met with a careful shrug and a suggestion that perhaps the hospital had simply made an error in her favor. She did not yet suspect the truth, though it waited only a short distance away, carried quietly by a man who had begun, without fully admitting it to himself, to care for her, in ways far beyond what any employer owed an employee. Late one night, as Elena passed through the west corridor on her way to bed, she overheard two guards speaking in low voices near the staircase, unaware of her approach. He has not been the same since she started, one of them murmured. Have you noticed? He used to work until dawn most nights. Now he leaves his study before midnight most evenings. Do not let him hear you say that, the other replied. But you are right. Something about her has calmed him in a way none of us ever managed. Elena slipped past unnoticed, her heart pounding with a mixture of confusion and something she was not yet ready to name. She told herself, as she climbed the stairs to her small room, that it meant nothing, that powerful men were simply unpredictable, that she should focus only on her work and her mother and nothing else. But as she lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling of her narrow room, she could not stop thinking about the quiet honesty in Vincent's voice when he had spoken of his father, or the strange, gentle order he had given her to rest instead of work, or the warmth of his shoulder beneath her cheek during the 20 minutes she had slept more peacefully than she had in over a year. She did not yet understand how deeply those small moments had already begun to change everything, for both of them, in ways that neither the danger surrounding his world nor the exhaustion consuming her own life would be able to stop. The envelope arrived without warning, slipped beneath the door of Elena's small room sometime before dawn, and she nearly stepped on it in her rush to prepare for the morning. Inside was a single sheet of paper confirming that her mother's remaining medical debt had been paid in full. No name was attached, no explanation offered, only a stamp from the hospital's billing office and a balance that now read 0. Elena sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the paper, her hands trembling slightly. She had assumed, over the past weeks, that some clerical error had been quietly reducing the debt, bit by bit. This was different. This was final, complete, and far too large a sum to be explained by any mistake. She knew, somehow, exactly who was responsible, though she had no proof beyond instinct, and the strange, careful attentiveness Vincent had shown her in recent weeks. She dressed quickly and made her way to his study before her regular duties began, her heart pounding with a mixture of gratitude and something closer to fear. Gifts like this were never simple, not in a house like this one. Vincent was already awake when she knocked, seated behind his desk with a cup of coffee he had not yet touched. He looked up as she entered, and something in his expression told her immediately that her suspicion was correct. You paid it, she said quietly, holding up the letter. All of it. He did not deny it. It was a small matter. It was not a small matter, sir. It was thousands of dollars. I cannot possibly repay you for something like this. I did not ask you to repay it. Then why? Elena asked, her voice caught somewhere between confusion and disbelief. Why would you do something like this for me? Vincent set down his pen and studied her for a long moment, choosing his words with unusual care. Because you have carried a weight that no one should carry alone, and I found that I did not wish to watch you continue carrying it while I had the ability to lighten it. He paused. That is the truth, Elena, as uncomfortable as it may be for either of us to admit. Elena stood frozen near the door, unsure how to respond to an honesty so plain it left no room for polite deflection. I do not know what to say, sir. You do not need to say anything. I did not do it expecting gratitude. Then what did you expect? The question hung in the air between them, heavier than either of them had intended. Vincent rose from his desk and crossed the room slowly, stopping a respectful distance away, though close enough that Elena could see the uncertainty flickering behind his usually guarded eyes. "I expected nothing," he said finally. "I am still uncertain what I hope for now." Before Elena could respond, the study door opened abruptly, and Dominic stepped inside, his expression grim and urgent enough that both of them immediately understood something serious had happened. "Sir, we have a problem," Dominic said, glancing briefly at Elena before continuing. "The Castellano family has made a move on the docks. 2 of our shipments were seized overnight, and 1 of our men was injured during the confrontation." Vincent's entire demeanor shifted instantly, the softness of a moment ago, replaced by a hardened focus Elena had not seen since her first day in the mansion. "How badly injured?" "He will recover. But this was a message, sir. They are testing how far they can push us." "Gather the others," Vincent said, his voice cold and controlled. "I want a full report within the hour." Dominic nodded and left as quickly as he had arrived. Vincent turned back to Elena, his expression softening only slightly, the urgency of the situation clearly pulling him toward duties far removed from whatever fragile conversation had been building between them moments before. "You should return to your work," he said, though his voice carried none of the coldness he had just directed toward Dominic. "This will not concern you." "Is everything all right, sir?" "It will be handled," he said simply, though something in his tone suggested he was not entirely certain of that himself. "Go, Elena, please." She left the study reluctantly, her mind spinning with questions she knew better than to ask aloud. The household staff, she quickly realized, had already sensed the shift in atmosphere. Guards moved with renewed urgency through the halls. Margaret's expression, when Elena found her in the kitchen, was tighter than usual, her hands moving quickly as she prepared trays of coffee for the men gathering in the East Wing. "Trouble with the Castellano family," Margaret said quietly, before Elena could even ask. "It happens every so often. Rival families testing boundaries, reminding each other who controls what. It usually passes within a few days." "Usually?" Margaret's silence answered the question Elena had not quite dared to ask. The following days passed in a tense, watchful blur. Vincent disappeared into meetings that stretched long into the night, his study door closed more often than open, his voice, when Elena occasionally overheard it through the walls, sharp with a controlled fury she had not witnessed since her earliest days in the household. Additional guards appeared at the gates and throughout the grounds, their presence a constant, unspoken reminder of the danger that lived just beneath the surface of this beautiful, dangerous house. Elena tried to focus on her duties, though she found herself watching Vincent more closely than she should have, noticing the exhaustion deepening beneath his eyes, the way his shoulders carried a new tension that had not been there before the trouble began. She wanted to ask if he was all right, wanted to offer the same quiet comfort he had once offered her, but she reminded herself, repeatedly, that this was not her place, that the dangerous world he moved through was not one she belonged in or understood. 4 days after the incident at the docks, Elena was asked to bring dinner to the study late in the evening, as the household's usual staff had already retired for the night. She found Vincent seated at his desk, surrounded by maps and documents, his tie discarded, his eyes red with exhaustion. He barely looked up as she entered. "Set it there," he murmured, gesturing vaguely toward the desk. Elena set the tray down carefully, then hesitated, watching him rub his temples with a weariness that seemed to reach far beyond simple tiredness. "Sir, may I ask something?" He glanced up, surprised by the question. "Go ahead." "Are you all right?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. He studied her for a long moment before answering, his voice quieter than usual. "This business is more difficult than most people understand, Elena. Every decision carries weight. Every mistake costs something, often something far greater than money. Is anyone in danger?" "Everyone in this house is in danger, in one way or another," he said honestly, his gaze meeting hers directly. "That is simply the nature of the life I inherited. I have tried, since my father's death, to keep that danger as far from this house as possible, but the Castellano family has never respected boundaries the way they should." Elena absorbed this information carefully, a cold knot forming in her stomach. "Am I in danger, sir, being here?" Vincent's expression shifted, something flickering behind his eyes that looked almost like guilt. "I would not allow harm to come to you, Elena. That I can promise you absolutely." "You cannot promise that entirely, sir. Not in a world like this." "No," he admitted quietly. "Perhaps not entirely, but I would do everything within my power to prevent it." The honesty in his voice settled something uneasy in her chest, though it did little to fully calm the fear his words had stirred. She lingered near the desk longer than her duties required, unsure how to leave a conversation that had suddenly become far more significant than either of them had intended. "You should eat something, sir," she said finally, gesturing toward the untouched tray. "You have not eaten properly in days." A faint, tired smile crossed his face, the first she had seen from him in nearly a week. "Are you concerned for my well-being, Elena?" "Someone should be, sir. You certainly are not concerned for it yourself." He chuckled quietly, a low, unfamiliar sound that seemed to surprise even him. "Perhaps you are right." He gestured toward the chair across from his desk. "Sit with me while I eat, if you are willing. I find I would prefer company tonight." Elena hesitated only briefly before lowering herself into the chair, watching as he finally began eating, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly with each passing minute. They spoke quietly for nearly an hour, conversation drifting between careful, guarded topics and small, unexpected moments of genuine connection. He asked about her childhood, and she told him about summers spent by the harbor before her father left, about her mother's quiet strength through years of hardship. She asked, carefully, about his own childhood, and he spoke, briefly and reluctantly, about a father who had taught him everything he knew about strength, and almost nothing about softness. "You are easier to talk to than anyone I have known in a very long time," Vincent admitted quietly, as the conversation began to wind down. "I am simply listening, sir. That is not a difficult skill. It is rarer than you might think, in my world." Elena rose eventually, aware of the late hour and her early morning duties ahead. Vincent walked her to the study door, an unfamiliar gesture that left her slightly breathless as they stood close together in the doorway. "Thank you, Elena," he said quietly, "for tonight." "You are welcome, sir." He hesitated, as though considering something further, then simply nodded and stepped back, allowing her to leave. Elena walked back to her room in a daze, her mind replaying the evening's conversation, unable to fully process the strange, growing warmth that had settled somewhere deep in her chest, despite every reasonable instinct warning her against it. The following morning brought fresh tension to the household. Elena woke to the sound of raised voices near the front entrance and hurried downstairs to find several unfamiliar men standing in the grand hall, their posture rigid with barely restrained hostility. Vincent stood opposite them, flanked by Dominic and two other guards, his expression carved from stone. "This is your final warning," one of the strangers said, his voice carrying an edge of menace that made Elena's blood run cold. "Return what was taken, or the next message will not be so gentle." "Get off my property," Vincent said, his voice low and dangerously calm. "Before I forget the courtesy my father always insisted upon." The men left without further argument, though the tension they left behind lingered thick in the air, long after the front doors closed behind them. Vincent turned and noticed Elena standing partway down the staircase, her face pale with alarm. "Go to your room, Elena," he said, his voice softer now, though still tight with barely controlled anger. "Please, stay there until I send word that it is safe." "What is happening, sir?" "Nothing you need concern yourself with. Please, do as I ask." Elena retreated upstairs, her heart pounding. The earlier warmth of the previous evening now tangled uncomfortably with genuine fear. She understood, in that moment, more clearly than ever before, exactly what kind of world she had stepped into, and exactly how much danger surrounded the man who had begun, against all reason, to matter to her, far more than she had ever intended to allow. She did not yet know that the true danger had only just begun, and that within days, the fragile piece of the mansion would shatter in ways that would test everything both of them had quietly begun to feel for each other. Elena spent the rest of that day confined to the upper floors of the mansion, watching from her window as unfamiliar cars came and went through the front gates, as guards paced the grounds with a new, restless energy. Margaret brought her meals rather than allowing her downstairs. Her expression tight with worry, she tried, unsuccessfully, to hide. "How bad is it?" Elena finally asked, unable to bear the silence any longer. Margaret set down the tray she carried and sat on the edge of the bed, her usual brisk efficiency softened by genuine concern. "The Castellano family believes we intercepted a shipment that belonged to them. Vincent insists we did nothing of the sort, and I believe him. But belief does not matter much in this business. Only power does, and how willing each side is to demonstrate it. Has something like this happened before?" "Many times, over many years," Margaret said. Vincent's father handled these conflicts with a certain patience, a willingness to negotiate before resorting to force. Vincent has that same instinct, though grief has made him quicker to anger since his father passed. Still, he tries. He tries harder than most men in his position would bother to. Elena absorbed this information quietly, turning it over in her mind, alongside everything else she had learned about the man who now consumed far too much of her thoughts. Is he in danger himself? Personally? Margaret's expression grew serious. "Everyone in this house is in some danger, child. Vincent most of all. But he is careful, and he is protected. Do not let fear consume you. Fear clouds judgment, and in this house, clear judgment is often the only thing that keeps people safe." The advice offered little comfort, though Elena tried to hold on to it as the day stretched into evening. She busied herself with small tasks Margaret assigned her, folding linens, organizing supply closets, anything to keep her hands occupied while her mind circled endlessly around the tension gripping the household. It was well past 9 that evening when a soft knock came at her door. She opened it to find Vincent standing in the hallway, looking as exhausted as she had ever seen him, though the earlier hardness in his expression had softened considerably. "I wanted to see that you were all right," he said quietly. "I am fine, sir. A little frightened, perhaps, but fine." He nodded, studying her for a long moment before speaking again. "I apologize for the tension you witnessed this morning. It is not something I wished you to see. You do not need to apologize for the nature of your business, sir. I understood, when I took this position, that it would not be simple. Understanding it and witnessing it are different things," he said. "I have tried, since you arrived, to shield you from the more difficult aspects of this life. I am not certain I have succeeded." Elena hesitated, then stepped back from the doorway, an unspoken invitation that Vincent seemed almost surprised to receive. He entered cautiously, glancing around the small, simple room that stood in such stark contrast to the rest of the mansion's grandeur. "It is not much," Elena said, suddenly self-conscious. "It is honest," Vincent replied. "There is a great deal to be said for honesty, in a house as full of pretense as this one often is." They sat together near the small window, the tension of the day slowly easing between them as conversation drifted into quieter, gentler territory. Vincent spoke, haltingly at first, about the weight of responsibility he had carried since his father's death, about decisions that kept him awake most nights, about the constant awareness that any misstep could cost lives, including the lives of people he had come to care for. "Is that why you have not married?" Elena asked, immediately regretting the boldness of the question. "I apologize, sir. That was not my place to ask." Vincent, however, did not seem offended. If anything, a faint, tired smile crossed his face. "It is a fair question. The truth is that I have never allowed myself to consider it seriously. This life does not leave much room for softness. Elena, I learned that lesson early, watching my father struggle to balance duty with the people he loved." "That sounds like a lonely way to live." "It has been," he admitted quietly. "Until recently." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning, neither of them seemed fully prepared to address directly. Elena felt her heart quicken, though she forced herself to look away, reminding herself of every reason such feelings were impossible, dangerous, foolish. "You should rest, sir," she said finally, rising from her seat. "Tomorrow will likely bring more difficult decisions." Vincent stood as well, though he lingered near the door longer than necessary. "Elena," he said quietly, "whatever happens with the Castellano family, I want you to know that your safety matters to me more than I am entirely comfortable admitting." "I understand, sir." "Do you?" His eyes searched hers with an intensity that left her breathless. "Because I am not certain I fully understand it myself." He left before she could formulate a response, the door closing softly behind him, leaving Elena alone with a whirlwind of emotions she did not know how to organize. She lay awake long into the night, staring at the ceiling, torn between the practical fear of the danger surrounding this house and the undeniable, growing warmth that had settled itself firmly in her chest, despite every reasonable objection her mind continued to raise. The following morning brought an uneasy calm to the mansion. Vincent left early for a meeting with representatives from a neutral family, hoping to negotiate a resolution before tensions escalated further. Elena resumed her regular duties, though the household staff remained visibly on edge, guards patrolling more frequently than usual, conversations hushed and careful throughout the halls. She found herself, during a brief pause in her work, standing near the study window overlooking the front gates, watching for any sign of Vincent's return. Margaret found her there and offered a knowing, gentle smile. "You care for him," Margaret said simply. It was not a question. Elena's cheeks warmed instantly. "I should not, Margaret. I know that. He is my employer, and this world he lives in is nothing like anything I have ever known." "Caring rarely consults reason before it settles into a heart," Margaret said, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had watched this household through many difficult seasons. "I have worked for this family for over 20 years, Elena. I watched Vincent grow from a boy who laughed easily into a man who forgot how. In the weeks since you arrived, I have seen glimpses of that boy again, more than I have seen in years. That frightens me as much as it comforts me," Elena admitted quietly. "It should," Margaret said honestly. "Love in this world carries risks that ordinary people never have to consider. But sometimes, child, the risk is worth what it offers in return." Elena said nothing further, though Margaret's words settled deep within her, alongside the fear and uncertainty that had become constant companions since her arrival at the mansion. She returned to her duties with a heavy heart, uncertain what the coming days would bring, only knowing that whatever fragile connection had formed between herself and Vincent Marchetti had grown far too significant to easily ignore or walk away from. Vincent returned late that afternoon, his expression grim despite hours of negotiation. He called Dominic and several other trusted men into his study immediately, and Elena, passing by with a stack of linens, caught fragments of the conversation through the partially closed door. "They are not interested in resolution," Vincent's voice said, tight with barely controlled frustration. "They want to test whether we will retaliate or retreat. If we retreat, they will see it as weakness and push further. If we retaliate, this could escalate quickly." "What do you propose, sir?" Dominic asked. "We increase security immediately, throughout the property. No one enters or leaves without clearance. I want extra men stationed at every gate, and I want the perimeter checked twice daily rather than once." Elena hurried away before she could be discovered listening, her heart pounding with renewed anxiety. The mansion, once a place of quiet, exhausting routine, had transformed into something far more precarious, a battlefield disguised as a household, and she found herself, for the first time since her arrival, genuinely uncertain whether she had made the right decision in accepting this position at all. That night, as she prepared for bed, a soft knock interrupted her thoughts once again. She opened the door to find Vincent standing there, his expression softer than the harsh authority she had witnessed through the study door hours earlier. "I wanted to tell you myself," he said quietly, "rather than have you hear it through household gossip. Security will be tightened significantly over the coming days. I do not say this to frighten you, only to prepare you. I overheard some of your conversation earlier, sir. I already understood the situation was serious." He studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. "I am sorry you have been drawn into this, Elena. You deserve a life far simpler than the one unfolding around you here. I chose to take this position, sir. Whatever comes with it, I accept that responsibility." "Even the danger?" "Even the danger," she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her own voice. Vincent's expression softened further, something almost tender passing across his usually guarded features. "You are unlike anyone I have ever known, Elena Whitmore." "Is that a compliment, sir?" "It is the truest compliment I know how to give," he said quietly, before stepping back and bidding her good night. Elena closed the door slowly, her heart racing, torn between fear for what the coming days might bring, and an undeniable, growing certainty that whatever happened, she no longer wished to face it from a distance, safely uninvolved. Somewhere along the past few weeks, without ever intending to, she had allowed herself to care deeply for a man whose world was built on danger, and she was no longer entirely certain she wanted to protect herself from that reality, whatever risks it carried. Gunfire echoed across the eastern grounds just after 2 in the morning, jolting Elena awake with a violence that sent her heart slamming against her ribs, before her mind had even fully registered the sound. She sat upright in the darkness, listening as shouts erupted somewhere near the front gates, followed by the sound of running footsteps in the hallway outside her door. She threw on her robe and cracked the door open, only to find Margaret rushing past, her face pale with alarm. "Stay inside," Margaret ordered sharply. "Lock your door, and do not come out until someone tells you it is safe." "What is happening?" "The Castellano family. They have breached the outer perimeter. Stay inside, Elena. I mean it." Margaret hurried away before Elena could ask anything further, leaving her alone in the darkness with nothing but the distant sound of chaos to fill the silence. She locked her door as instructed, her hands trembling so badly it took 3 attempts to turn the small bolt. She pressed herself against the wall beside her window, peering carefully through the curtains toward the grounds below. Flashlights swept across the darkened lawn. Men in dark clothing moved swiftly between the shadows of the garden hedges, and she could just make out Vincent's tall figure near the main gate, directing his guards with sharp, urgent gestures. Her stomach twisted with fear as she watched him move directly toward the source of the danger, rather than away from it, his commitment to protecting his household clearly outweighing any instinct toward personal safety. The sound of shouting grew louder, closer, and Elena's breath caught as she realized the confrontation had moved nearer to the main house itself. She backed away from the window, pressing herself into the corner of her room, torn between the instruction to stay hidden and an overwhelming urge to somehow help, though she had no idea how someone as ordinary as herself could possibly assist in a situation this dangerous. Minutes passed like hours. The gunfire eventually slowed, then stopped entirely, replaced by tense, muffled voices and the sound of vehicles moving quickly away from the property. Elena remained frozen in her corner, unsure whether the silence meant safety or something far worse, until a soft, urgent knock finally sounded at her door. "Elena, it is Margaret. Open the door." She scrambled to unlock it, relief flooding through her at the sight of Margaret's familiar face, though the older woman's expression carried a gravity that immediately reignited her fear. "Is it over?" Elena asked. "For now," Margaret said. "The Castellano men were repelled before they breached the main house. No one on our side was seriously injured, though it was close." "And Vincent?" Margaret hesitated for just a moment too long before answering. "He is shaken but unharmed physically. He is asking for you." Elena's heart lurched at the words, confusion and concern tangling together, as she followed Margaret quickly through the darkened halls toward the study. She found Vincent standing near the window, his shirt torn at the shoulder, a shallow cut visible along his forearm, where he had clearly been grazed by something during the confrontation. He turned as she entered, and the relief that flooded his face at the sight of her was unmistakable, raw and unguarded, in a way she had never witnessed from him before. "Elena," he breathed, crossing the room quickly, stopping just short of reaching for her, as though uncertain whether he had the right to. "You are safe." "I am fine. Vincent, you are hurt." "It is nothing. A graze, nothing more." He studied her face carefully, as though needing to confirm with his own eyes that she was truly unharmed. "I was terrified something had happened to you tonight, more terrified than I have been in years. I was in my room the entire time, exactly as Margaret instructed. I knew that, and still, I could not stop imagining the worst." He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair, the composed authority he usually carried, noticeably fractured by the events of the night. "This is exactly what I feared would happen, the moment I allowed myself to care for someone in a world this dangerous." Elena stepped closer, an instinct overriding every reasonable hesitation she might otherwise have felt. "You are allowed to care about people, Vincent. Even in this world. Am I? Because tonight, I very nearly lost the ability to protect the one person who has come to matter most to me since my father died." His voice cracked slightly on the final words, an admission that seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised her. "I am here," Elena said softly. "I am safe. We both are." Vincent closed the remaining distance between them then, pulling her carefully into an embrace that spoke of relief, far deeper than mere professional concern. Elena did not resist, allowing herself, for the first time since arriving at this dangerous, beautiful house, to simply exist within a moment of genuine, unguarded connection. "I need to tell you something," Vincent said quietly, still holding her close. "Something I should have said before tonight forced my hand." "What is it?" He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, his expression more vulnerable than she had ever witnessed. "I have fallen in love with you, Elena. I did not intend for it to happen, and I know how impossible, how reckless it must seem, given everything surrounding my life. But I cannot pretend any longer that what I feel for you is simply concern for an employee." Elena's breath caught, the weight of his confession settling over her with a force that left her momentarily speechless. She had suspected, of course, over the past weeks, that something significant had grown between them. Hearing it spoken plainly, especially in the aftermath of such danger, made it undeniably, terrifyingly real. "I feel the same," she admitted quietly. "I have tried to convince myself otherwise, for both our sakes, but I cannot deny it any longer either." Relief and something far warmer flooded Vincent's expression. He reached up, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face, his touch careful and reverent in a way that contrasted sharply with the violence that had unfolded on the grounds only minutes earlier. "I know this world is dangerous, Elena. I know I cannot promise you safety. Not fully, not in a life built on the foundation mine is built upon. But I promise you this. I will do everything within my power to protect you, and to be worthy of what you have chosen to feel for me. I do not need promises of safety, Vincent. I need honesty, and I need to know that whatever comes, we face it together." "Together," he repeated softly, as though testing the weight of the word. "I have not shared that burden with anyone, in a very long time." Their conversation was interrupted by Dominic's cautious knock at the study door, his expression apologetic as he stepped inside. "Sir, forgive the interruption. We have secured the perimeter, and I have a preliminary report on tonight's incident, if you are ready." "Give us a moment," Vincent said, though his eyes remained on Elena, silently asking whether she needed him to stay, or whether she understood the demands his position required, even now. "Go," Elena said gently. "Your people need you." "I will be here." Vincent pressed a brief, gentle kiss to her forehead before releasing her, his expression carrying a warmth entirely absent from the cold authority he usually presented to the world. "Thank you, Elena, for tonight, and for everything before it." She watched him leave with Dominic, her heart still racing from the events of the night and the confession that had passed between them, uncertain what the coming days would demand of either of them, only certain that whatever came, she no longer wished to face it as a distant, uninvolved observer. She had chosen, somewhere in the quiet weeks since her arrival, to care deeply for a man whose world was built on danger, and now, in the aftermath of violence that had nearly cost him far more than a shallow wound, she understood with absolute clarity that there was no retreating from that choice. The following morning brought a household transformed by the events of the previous night. Additional guards patrolled every corner of the property. Vincent moved through the halls with renewed intensity, coordinating security measures, with a focus that left little room for anything else. Yet even amid the heightened tension, Elena noticed small changes in how he treated her, no longer bothering to disguise the warmth in his eyes whenever their paths crossed, no longer hesitating to seek her out during brief pauses in his demanding schedule. Margaret, observing these changes with her usual quiet perceptiveness, pulled Elena aside during a rare, calm moment in the kitchen. "It has happened then," she said simply. "What has happened?" "He has let you in completely. I have watched this family for over 20 years, Elena, and I have never seen Vincent look at anyone the way he looks at you now." Margaret's expression carried both warmth and worry in equal measure. "Guard your heart carefully, child. What you have found is rare and precious, but it will not come without cost." Elena nodded, understanding the truth of Margaret's words more deeply than ever before. Whatever peace had settled over the mansion following the previous night's violence felt fragile, temporary, a brief pause before whatever came next. She did not yet know how soon that fragile peace would be tested again, nor how much would be demanded of both her and Vincent before they could claim any lasting stability together. 3 days after the attack on the perimeter, Vincent called a meeting with the heads of 2 neutral families, hoping to broker a lasting resolution with the Castellanos before further violence could erupt. Elena watched him prepare for the meeting with a focus she had not seen from him before, reviewing documents late into the night, rehearsing arguments with Dominic, weighing every possible outcome with the careful precision of a man who understood exactly how much rested on the decisions ahead. "Are you frightened?" she asked him quietly, the evening before the meeting, as she brought him a final cup of coffee before he retired for what little rest he would allow himself. "Frightened is not quite the word," he admitted, setting down his pen and rubbing his tired eyes. "Cautious, perhaps. Aware of the stakes. I have spent years building a version of stability in this business, Elena, and I do not intend to lose it over pride or carelessness." "You are not your father," she said gently, remembering the stories he had shared with her about the man whose shadow he still worked so hard to live up to. "You do not have to solve everything the way he might have." Vincent looked up at her with something like surprise, as though the thought had not fully occurred to him before. "No," he said slowly. "Perhaps I do not." He reached for her hand, holding it gently for a long moment. "You have a way of making complicated things feel simple, Elena, even when they are not. I only speak the truth as I see it. That is precisely why it matters so much," he said quietly. The meeting the following day stretched long into the evening, and Elena spent the hours pacing quietly through the mansion, unable to focus on her usual duties, her mind consumed with worry for how the negotiations might unfold. When Vincent finally returned, his expression carried a cautious relief that immediately eased the tightness in her chest. "It is resolved, for now," he told her, once they were alone in his study. "The Castellano family has agreed to a truce, mediated by parties both sides trust. It will not erase the tension entirely, but it buys us peace, at least for the foreseeable future." "That is wonderful news, Vincent." "It is," he agreed, though something more serious lingered behind his eyes. "But peace in this business is rarely permanent, Elena. I want you to understand that clearly, even as we allow ourselves this relief tonight." "I understand," she said softly. "I am not asking for guarantees, Vincent. I am simply grateful for tonight." He pulled her close then, resting his forehead gently against hers, the exhaustion of the past difficult days finally beginning to ease from his shoulders. "Tonight, I only want to remember what it feels like to be grateful for something good, after so many days spent bracing for something terrible." They remained together in comfortable silence for a long while, the fragile peace of the household settling gently around them, like a held breath finally released. Elena allowed herself, for the first time since the violence of days before, to simply feel hopeful, though a small, cautious part of her mind reminded her that Margaret's warning still held true. Whatever she and Vincent had found together was rare and precious, but the world surrounding them remained as dangerous as ever, and she suspected, with quiet unease, that the true test of their fragile happiness still waited somewhere ahead. The black car appeared at the edge of the market square just as Elena stepped out of the pharmacy, and by the time she noticed it, 2 men had already crossed the street toward her with a purpose that made her stomach drop with instant, primal fear. She had gone into the city that morning for the first time in weeks, granted a rare few hours of freedom to visit her mother and collect a prescription refill, escorted, as Vincent now insisted, by one of his trusted guards, a quiet young man named Nathaniel, who waited by the car parked just around the corner. But the pharmacy line had been long, and Nathaniel had stepped away briefly to answer a call, and in that small window of time, the 2 strangers had found her alone. "Elena Whitmore," one of the men said, his voice carrying none of the friendliness his casual tone suggested. "You will come with us, quietly, if you value your safety." "I do not know who you are," Elena said, backing away instinctively, her heart hammering against her ribs. "You do not need to know," the second man said, moving to block her path toward the car. "You only need to understand that Vincent Marchetti will make a very different decision about the Castellano family once he understands what is at stake. The truth crashed over her with sickening clarity. The truce, it seemed, had never truly held. She opened her mouth to scream, but a firm hand closed over her arm, dragging her toward a waiting vehicle before Nathaniel could return from his call. She fought as hard as she could, twisting and pulling against the man's grip, but he was far stronger, and within moments, she found herself forced into the back of an unmarked car, the door slamming shut behind her as the vehicle sped away from the market square. Nathaniel returned to find the street empty except for a dropped pharmacy bag and Elena's phone, cracked and abandoned on the pavement. His blood ran cold as he immediately radioed the mansion, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. Vincent received the call in his study, and the color drained from his face so completely that Dominic, standing nearby, instinctively reached for his weapon before Vincent had even finished speaking. "They took her," Vincent said, his voice deadly quiet, in a way far more frightening than shouting could ever have been. "The Castellano family has taken Elena." The mansion transformed within minutes into a coordinated storm of activity. Vincent's usual careful, measured authority sharpened into something colder, more focused, and far more dangerous than anyone in the household had witnessed, even during the height of the previous conflict. He gathered every available man, called in favors from contacts throughout the city, and began tracing every possible lead toward wherever the Castellano family might be holding her. "They will use her as leverage," Dominic said grimly, as the team gathered around a table covered in maps and phone records. "They will want a meeting, terms, some concession that restores their standing after the truce we forced on them. Then we give them a meeting," Vincent said, his voice hard as iron. "But it will be on our terms, and they will regret ever laying a hand on her." Meanwhile, in a dim, unfamiliar room somewhere across the city, Elena sat with her hands bound loosely in front of her, forcing herself to breathe slowly, despite the terror threatening to overwhelm her. The two men who had taken her stood near the door, occasionally glancing toward her with expressions that mixed calculation with something almost like discomfort, as though even they were uneasy with the task assigned to them. "You do not need to be afraid," one of them said eventually, his voice softer than she expected. "We are not here to harm you. We are here to send a message." What kind of message requires kidnapping an innocent person? The kind that reminds Vincent Marchetti that peace is not something he can simply demand and receive without concession, the man replied. "Our employer wants territory returned that Marchetti's family took years ago. You are simply the means of ensuring he listens carefully to that demand." Elena said nothing further, though her mind raced, cataloging every detail of the room, the voices, anything that might later prove useful. She thought of Vincent, of the fear he must be feeling, of the danger he would undoubtedly place himself in to secure her release, and found herself praying, more fervently than she had in years, that he would approach whatever confrontation came next with caution, rather than reckless fury. Hours passed in tense uncertainty before the door finally opened again, revealing an older man dressed in an expensive suit, his expression carrying the calm authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his tone almost courteous despite the circumstances. "I apologize for the inconvenience. I am Salvatore Castellano. I believe you have heard my family's name mentioned once or twice." "What do you want?" Elena asked, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage. "I want what should have been mine years ago," Salvatore said simply. "Territory Vincent's father took through methods I never considered entirely fair. I have tried negotiation. I have tried patience. Neither approach has yielded results. So now I try something more persuasive. Vincent will not simply hand over territory because you have taken me," Elena said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own defiance. Salvatore's expression flickered with something like amusement. "You underestimate how deeply he has come to care for you, Miss Whitmore. My sources tell me he has changed considerably since you entered his household. Grief makes men reckless when it comes to protecting what they love. I intend to use that recklessness to my advantage." Elena felt a chill settle over her at his words, understanding now the full calculation behind her captivity, the careful, deliberate cruelty of using Vincent's growing feelings against him. She said nothing further, refusing to give Salvatore any additional insight into the depth of what existed between herself and Vincent. Back at the mansion, Vincent had received the call he had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. Salvatore's voice carried the same practiced calm Elena had witnessed firsthand, outlining his demands with businesslike precision. Territory returned, a public acknowledgement of Castellano authority in certain districts, and, only then, Elena's safe return. "You have until midnight tomorrow," Salvatore said. "I would advise against involving law enforcement, Vincent. That would end very badly for Miss Whitmore, and I suspect you understand exactly what I mean by that." The call ended, and Vincent stood motionless for a long moment, his hands clenched so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. Dominic watched him carefully, recognizing the barely contained fury simmering beneath his controlled exterior. "Sir, what do we do?" "We do not hand over territory that was fought for and earned," Vincent said, his voice low and dangerous. "But we also do not sacrifice Elena for pride." He turned to face his assembled men, his expression carved from cold, unyielding determination. "We find their location before midnight tomorrow, and we take her back ourselves." Quietly, precisely, without giving Salvatore the satisfaction of dictating terms to us at all. The next 20 hours passed in a blur of careful, coordinated planning. Vincent called on contacts throughout the city, tracing shipping records, informants, and old debts owed to his father years earlier, piecing together fragments of information that gradually narrowed toward a warehouse near the eastern docks, a property known to belong to one of Salvatore's business associates. Elena, meanwhile, endured the long hours of captivity with as much composure as she could manage, refusing every attempt by her captors to unsettle her further. She thought constantly of her mother, praying that someone had thought to explain her absence gently, and of Vincent, holding on to faith that he would find a way to reach her that did not require sacrificing everything he had worked to protect. Night fell, and with it came the moment Vincent had been preparing for. He arrived at the warehouse with a small, carefully selected team, moving with the precision of a man who had spent years learning exactly how to navigate danger without unnecessary bloodshed. Dominic led half the team toward the rear entrance, while Vincent approached from the front, his expression a mask of controlled, lethal calm. Inside, Elena heard the sudden shift in atmosphere before she fully understood its cause. Raised voices near the entrance, the sound of a struggle breaking out somewhere beyond the room where she was held. Her heart leapt with desperate hope, even as fear for Vincent's safety consumed her equally. The door burst open moments later, and Vincent stood in the doorway, his expression shifting instantly from cold fury to overwhelming relief at the sight of her, unharmed, seated exactly where he had feared finding her in far worse condition. "Elena," he breathed, crossing the room in 3 quick strides and kneeling to untie the ropes binding her hands with careful, urgent precision. "You came," she said, her voice breaking with relief as he pulled her into his arms. "Of course I came," he said fiercely. "I would have torn this entire city apart to find you." Outside, the confrontation between Vincent's men and Salvatore's guards resolved quickly, once Salvatore himself realized the balance of power had shifted entirely against him. Vincent's careful planning had ensured his team significantly outnumbered the guards left to secure the warehouse, and within minutes, the immediate danger had passed, leaving Salvatore standing alone, furious but ultimately unwilling to escalate further without adequate support. "This is not finished, Marchetti," Salvatore spat, as Vincent's men restrained him briefly before releasing him under the watchful eyes of several armed guards. "It is finished," Vincent said coldly, one arm still wrapped protectively around Elena's shoulders. "You laid hands on someone under my protection. Consider this your only warning that such a mistake will not happen twice." Salvatore's expression tightened with barely restrained fury, though he said nothing further, clearly recognizing that further conflict tonight would only end poorly for his own interests. He retreated with what remained of his dignity, leaving Vincent and his team to secure the warehouse and confirm that Elena required no further medical attention beyond the exhaustion and lingering fear of her ordeal. The drive back to the mansion passed in near silence, Elena curled against Vincent's side in the back of the car, his arm wrapped tightly around her as though he could not bear to release her even for a moment. Neither of them spoke until they reached the safety of the mansion grounds, the familiar gates closing behind them, with a finality that finally allowed the tension of the previous hours to fully release. "I was so afraid," Elena admitted quietly, once they were alone in his study, the adrenaline of the ordeal finally beginning to fade into exhausted relief. "Not for myself, entirely, for you. I was afraid of what you might have to sacrifice to bring me back safely." "I would have sacrificed anything," Vincent said honestly, pulling her close once again. "Territory, standing, everything I have built since my father died, none of it matters as much as you do, Elena. Tonight made that clearer to me than anything else ever could. You did not have to sacrifice any of it, in the end." "No," he agreed quietly, "but I want you to understand that I would have, without hesitation, if it meant bringing you home safely." They remained together long into the night, the fragile relief of survival gradually settling into something steadier, more certain. Elena understood now, with absolute clarity, the full weight of the danger that surrounded the man she loved, and rather than driving her away, the ordeal had only strengthened her resolve to stand beside him, whatever future challenges their fragile peace might still hold. The days following Elena's rescue brought a strange, careful stillness to the mansion, as though the entire household was holding its breath, waiting to see whether Salvatore Castellano would honor the unspoken warning Vincent had delivered, or whether further retaliation would follow. Vincent doubled security once again, though this time he extended those precautions to include Elena's mother as well, arranging for a discreet, protective presence near her small apartment, without ever informing her of the true reason behind it. Elena struggled, in the days immediately following her captivity, with a lingering unease she found difficult to shake. She startled at unexpected sounds, found herself glancing toward windows and doors more frequently than before, and woke some nights from restless dreams she could not fully remember upon waking. Vincent noticed, of course, as he noticed nearly everything about her now, and he made a quiet, deliberate effort to remain close during those difficult days, never pressuring her to discuss what she had endured, simply offering steady, patient presence whenever she needed it. "You do not have to pretend to be unaffected," he told her gently, one evening as they sat together near the fireplace in his private sitting room. "What happened to you was frightening. It is all right to still feel that fear, even now that you are safe." "I do not want it to control me," Elena admitted quietly. "I do not want Salvatore Castellano to take anything more from me than he already has." "He has not taken anything from you that you are not choosing to reclaim," Vincent said, reaching for her hand. "Healing takes time, Elena. There is no shame in allowing yourself that time." His patience and understanding, so different from the harsh, guarded man she had first encountered weeks earlier, continued to surprise her, even now. She found herself, gradually, over the following days, feeling steadier, more secure, the sharp edges of her fear softening slightly with each day that passed without further incident. Margaret, too, played a quiet role in Elena's recovery, sitting with her during idle afternoons, sharing stories from her own long years within the household, offering the kind of steady, grandmotherly comfort Elena had not realized she desperately needed until it was offered. "You survived something many people in this world never survive," Margaret told her one afternoon, as they sat together shelling peas in the kitchen. "That takes a strength most people never have to discover in themselves. Do not diminish what you have overcome." Nearly a week after the rescue, Vincent called a private meeting with two of the neutral families who had originally helped broker the truce, presenting clear evidence of Salvatore's violation of their agreement. The neutral families, unwilling to be associated with such a blatant breach of trust, withdrew their support from Castellano's operations, isolating him considerably within the city's careful balance of power. Word soon reached Vincent that Salvatore, weakened by the loss of his allies and unwilling to risk further conflict without adequate backing, had quietly begun withdrawing his more aggressive operations from the districts bordering Marchetti territory. "It is not a complete resolution," Vincent explained to Elena, as they reviewed the news together in his study. "Salvatore remains a threat, and men like him rarely abandon their ambitions entirely. But for now, the immediate danger has passed. He understands the cost of moving against us directly has become too high for him to bear easily." "Does that mean we are safe?" Elena asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "It means we are safer than we were. Vincent said honestly. I will not insult you with false promises of complete safety, Elena. This world does not offer guarantees like that. But I will promise you this. I will never stop working to protect what we have built together, whatever threats remain. Elena nodded, accepting the honest uncertainty of his answer with a steadiness that surprised even herself. She had entered this relationship, however unintentionally, with eyes now fully open to the dangers it carried, and rather than retreating from that knowledge, she found herself more determined than ever to remain beside Vincent through whatever challenges still lay ahead. That evening, as the sun set over the mansion's gardens, Vincent led her outside to the terrace overlooking the grounds where, weeks earlier, gunfire had once shattered the peaceful night air. Now, the gardens stood quiet and calm, illuminated softly by strings of lights Vincent had ordered installed sometime during the past chaotic week. A small, deliberate reclaiming of beauty after so much fear.
I wanted you to see this, he said quietly, gesturing toward the transformed garden.
I wanted to give you a memory of this place that was not tied to violence or fear. Elena looked around at the softly lit garden, tears gathering unexpectedly in her eyes at the thoughtful gesture. It is beautiful, Vincent. Not as beautiful as you, he said softly, drawing her close. Elena, these past weeks have taught me more about myself, about what truly matters, than the past 3 years combined. I do not wish to waste any more time pretending I do not know exactly what I want. What do you want? She asked, her heart racing with anticipation. You, he said simply. Beside me, permanently, not simply as staff within this household, but as someone I am proud to call mine, entirely and without hesitation. Elena's breath caught at the weight and sincerity of his words, understanding, with growing certainty, exactly what he was building toward, even before he reached carefully into his jacket pocket. The small velvet box caught the soft glow of the garden lights as Vincent opened it slowly, revealing a simple, elegant ring that spoke more of quiet thoughtfulness than extravagant wealth. Elena stared at it, her breath caught somewhere between disbelief and overwhelming joy, unable to fully process how far the past weeks had carried them from where they had begun. I know this is not the traditional way such things are usually done, Vincent said, his voice carrying a vulnerability she had rarely witnessed from him. I know we have known each other only a matter of months, and that the circumstances surrounding our time together have been far from ordinary. But Elena, I have never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you, entirely and without reservation, and I would consider it the greatest honor of my life if you would agree to build a future alongside me. Tears spilled freely down Elena's cheeks as she nodded, unable to trust her voice for several long seconds. Yes, she finally managed, her voice thick with emotion. Yes, Vincent. Absolutely yes. He slid the ring onto her trembling hand with careful reverence, then pulled her into an embrace that spoke of relief, joy, and a future neither of them had dared imagine when Elena first walked through the mansion's front doors weeks earlier, exhausted and afraid, carrying nothing but a small suitcase and a desperate need to support her ailing mother. News of the engagement spread quickly through the household staff, met with genuine warmth rather than the careful, guarded reactions Elena had feared. Margaret, upon hearing the news, embraced Elena with tears in her own eyes, declaring that she had not seen the household this genuinely happy in longer than she could remember. Even Dominic, usually reserved and businesslike, offered a rare, genuine smile of congratulations, admitting quietly that he had never expected to see his employer this content. You have changed him, Margaret told Elena privately, a few days after the engagement. Not into someone different, but into someone more fully himself, the person grief and responsibility had buried beneath years of hardness. That is a rare gift, child. Treasure it, and treasure each other. The following weeks brought careful, joyful preparation alongside continued vigilance regarding the lingering tension with the Castellano family. Vincent balanced wedding preparations with ongoing business responsibilities, determined that their future together would begin on solid, secure footing rather than under the shadow of unresolved danger. He arranged for Elena's mother to relocate into a comfortable home near the mansion, ensuring she received proper medical care while remaining close enough for regular visits. a gesture that left Elena overwhelmed with gratitude for a kindness she had never imagined receiving from anyone, let alone a man once feared throughout the household for his harsh temper. "You did not have to do this," Elena told him, the day her mother moved into her new home, tears of joy streaming freely down her face as she watched her mother's delighted reaction to the bright, comfortable space. "I wanted to," Vincent said simply. "Your mother's happiness matters to me, Elena, because your happiness matters to me. There is very little I would not do to ensure both." Elena's mother, for her part, took an immediate liking to Vincent, though she teased him gently about the intimidating reputation that preceded him throughout the city. "My daughter tells me you once shattered glass against the wall simply from frustration," she said one evening, over dinner shared together for the first time as a growing family. "I hope marriage tempers that particular habit." Vincent laughed, a warm, genuine sound that had become increasingly familiar over recent weeks. "I promise to reserve such dramatics for only the most deserving circumstances," he said, earning a delighted laugh from Elena's mother and a warm, affectionate smile from Elena herself. As the wedding date approached, careful security measures remained in place throughout the preparations, a quiet reminder of the world Elena had chosen to fully embrace, alongside the man she loved. Salvatore Castellano, weakened considerably by the loss of his allies and unwilling to risk further confrontation, made no further moves against the Marchetti family, though Vincent remained cautiously vigilant, unwilling to allow complacency to endanger the fragile peace they had fought so hard to secure. The wedding itself took place on a clear, bright afternoon in the mansion's gardens, the same gardens where Vincent had once proposed beneath softly glowing lights, meant to reclaim beauty from the memory of violence. Elena walked down a simple aisle lined with white flowers, her mother seated proudly in the front row, Margaret dabbing gently at happy tears throughout the ceremony. The household staff gathered warmly to witness a transformation few of them had ever expected to see within these walls. Vincent waited for her at the end of the aisle, dressed simply despite his considerable wealth, his expression carrying none of the guarded hardness that had once defined him so completely. As Elena reached him, he took her hands gently in his own, his eyes bright with an emotion he no longer bothered to hide from anyone. "You saved me," he whispered, quiet enough that only she could hear. "Long before I understood I needed saving at all." "We saved each other," Elena whispered back, her heart full with a happiness she had never dared imagine finding, let alone within the walls of a mansion she had once entered trembling with exhaustion and fear. Their vows, exchanged simply and sincerely before their gathered household and a small circle of trusted allies, spoke not of grand promises or elaborate declarations, but of quiet, steady commitment, the kind built through shared hardship and unexpected tenderness rather than easy circumstance. Vincent promised to protect not only Elena's safety but her spirit, her independence, the quiet strength that had first drawn his attention on that exhausting first day in his study. Elena promised to stand beside him through whatever challenges his world might still bring, no longer as an outside observer forced into unwanted danger, but as a willing partner who had chosen, fully and without hesitation, to build a life alongside him. In the months that followed their wedding, the household settled into a new, steadier rhythm. Vincent, though still deeply involved in managing the family's extensive business interests, made deliberate efforts to create genuine boundaries between his work and his home, determined that the mansion would remain, as much as possible, a place of safety and warmth, rather than constant tension. He delegated increasing responsibility to Dominic and other trusted associates, allowing himself, for the first time since his father's death, moments of genuine rest and contentment. Elena, no longer burdened by the exhausting dual employment that had once left her perpetually drained, found new purpose within the household, gradually taking on responsibilities that matched her genuine strengths rather than mere survival necessity. She worked alongside Margaret to improve conditions for the household staff, ensuring fair schedules and genuine support for those who worked within the mansion's walls, remembering all too well the exhaustion she herself had once endured. The lingering tension with the Castellano family eventually resolved into a wary but stable peace, maintained through careful diplomacy and the clear understanding, reinforced by Salvatore's earlier failed aggression, that further conflict would carry costs he remained unwilling to bear. Vincent, wiser and more measured than the guarded, isolated man Elena had first encountered, worked steadily to strengthen alliances throughout the city, determined to build a legacy defined by stability rather than fear. On a quiet evening nearly a year after Elena's arrival at the mansion, the couple sat together on the same terrace where Vincent had once proposed, watching the sunset paint the gardens in soft golden light. Elena rested her head against his shoulder, echoing, in a far different context, the exhausted moment that had first drawn them together months earlier. "Do you ever think about that first night?" she asked quietly, "when I fell asleep on your shoulder in your study?" Vincent smiled, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head. "Often," he admitted. "It remains, to this day, the moment I first understood that something had shifted within me, something I did not yet have words for at the time." "I was so embarrassed," Elena laughed softly, remembering the mortification of that first exhausted mistake. "I was grateful," Vincent said honestly, "more grateful than I knew how to express at the time. You brought a stillness into my life I did not know I was desperately missing, Elena. A calm that nothing else, not power, not wealth, not even years of careful control, had ever managed to offer me." Elena lifted her head to look at him, her heart full with the quiet, steady happiness that had grown between them through danger, uncertainty, and ultimately, unwavering devotion. "I love you, Vincent Marchetti," she said softly, "not despite everything we have faced together, but partly because of the strength we discovered facing it. I love you, Vincent Marchetti," his voice carrying the same quiet certainty it always did now, no longer guarded, no longer afraid of the vulnerability such words once represented to him. "Today, tomorrow, and every difficult, beautiful day that follows." As darkness settled gently over the mansion, the gardens once scarred by gunfire now glowing softly with warm, welcoming light, Elena allowed herself, fully and completely, to feel safe. Not because danger had vanished entirely from the world Vincent moved through, but because she had found, within his arms, a steady, unshakable calm that no storm, past or future, could ever fully take away again. The Mafia boss no woman had ever managed to calm had finally found his peace, not through power or fear, but through the quiet, unexpected devotion of an exhausted maid who had once fallen asleep on his shoulder, and in doing so, had gently, permanently, calmed a heart no one else had ever reached.